this historic event, but not, unfortunately, not because of the scale or the nature of the atrocity, but because of who the victims were. I heard about it from a local guy I know who's a local workman, works in the area. He just passed by and told me he'd seen it on television, so I turned on the radio to find out what's going on. But and then, yeah, I mean, obviously a horrible atrocity, but you know, I reacted pretty much the way people did around the world. Terrible atrocity, but unless you're in Europe and the United States, you know, we're Japan, I guess, you know, it's nothing new. That's the way the imperial powers have treated the rest of the world for hundreds of years. And this is a historic event, but not, unfortunately, not because of the scale, or the nature of the atrocity, but because of who the victims were. You look through hundreds of years of history, the imperial countries have been basically immune. So there's plenty of atrocities, but they're somewhere else. I mean, like when Japan was carrying out atrocities in China, as far as I'm aware, there were no Chinese terrorist attacks in Tokyo. You know, it's always somewhere else, and that's gone on for hundreds of years. This is the first change. It's not so surprising. I mean, if you look at, actually I'd been talking and writing about these things before, and it's in technical literature all over the place. I mean, it has been well understood, and it's pretty obvious that with contemporary technology, it is possible for small groups without too much technological sophistication to carry out pretty awful atrocities. Well, the gas attack in Japan is an example. It's no use just screaming about it. If you're serious about trying to prevent further atrocities, you try to find out what their roots are. And whenever almost any crime in the streets, you know, a war or whatever it may be, there's usually something behind it that has elements of legitimacy, and you have to consider those elements. That's, again, true whether it's a crime in the streets or an aggressive power. Everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, it's a really easy way. Stop participating in it. Just about every government bent over backwards to join the U.S.-led coalition, always for their own reasons. I mean, maybe the most striking case, and the one that really tells you something about Western intellectuals, is Turkey. Turkish troops are now in Kabul, or will be soon, paid for by the United States to fight the war against terror. Why is Turkey offering troops? In fact, they were the first country to offer the U.S. troops for Afghanistan, and they explained why. It was ingratitude, because the United States was the only country that was willing to provide them with massive support for their own huge terrorist atrocities in southeast Turkey in the last few years. It's not ancient history. In fact, it's still going on. They carried out some of the worst atrocities of the 1990s. I mean, far beyond anything that Milosevic was accused of in Kosovo, were carried out about the same time in southeastern Turkey against maybe a quarter of the population, Kurds, who are horribly repressed, and millions of them were driven out of their homes, thousands of villages destroyed, maybe tens of thousands killed, every imaginable kind of barbaric torture. Clinton was pouring arms in. I mean, Turkey became the leading arms recipient in the world outside of Israel and Egypt, which are a different category. And they're very grateful that the U.S. was so willing to help them in carrying out massive state terror. And in reward, they're now fighting the war on terror. You know, the fact that Western intellectuals kind of look at this and not say anything, is a really impressive testimonial to the discipline of educated people. And it's a rather striking fact about the West. I don't know if anyone in Japan noticed it, but it's extremely dramatic. Actually, I just had an interview this afternoon with German major German journal, and pointed this out, and pointed out to them, which they ought to know, that although the U.S. was the primary funder of Turkey, Germany was the second. What about that? Everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, it's a really easy way. Stop participating in it. I mean, that alone will reduce the amount of terrorism in the world by an enormous quantity. It's true of just about every country that I know to varying degrees, but dramatically true for the U.S. and Britain and Germany and others. In March, that was the 40th anniversary of the public announcement that the U.S. is attacking South Vietnam, that U.S. pilots are bombing South Vietnam, that they began to use chemical warfare for crop destruction, started driving millions of people into concentration camps. This is all in South Vietnam. No Russians, no Chinese, not even any North Vietnamese, assuming they're not allowed to be in their own country. Just a U.S. war against South Vietnam, openly announced. No commemoration after 40 years, because nobody even knows. It's not important. If we do that to other people, that's normal. It's if they do something to us that the world is coming to an end. But if we do it to them, it's unnormal. Why should we even talk about it?
And likewise in Japan.
Yeah, same thing. Actually, it's better in Japan. Japan was defeated, and defeated countries are forced to pay some attention to what they did. Victors never are. I mean, take a look at the Tokyo trials. You know, undoubtedly the people were guilty of all kind of crimes, but the trials were a total farce. I mean, from a legal or any other point of view, they were disgraceful. And did anybody try the U.S. criminals? In fact, you know, it's kind of interesting the way Nuremberg, the way the principles were constructed. They had to decide at Nuremberg what's going to count as a war crime, and there was a very explicit definition, and it was conscious. You know, it's not hidden. A crime is a war crime if the Germans committed it and we didn't. So, for example, bombing of urban concentrations was not a war crime, because the British and the Americans did more of it than the Germans did, so therefore it's not a war crime. And German submarine commanders were able to bring testimony in defense by American submarine commanders who said, yeah, we did the same thing, and they were therefore free because it wasn't a crime. So if they do it, and it gets even worse than this. I mean, for example, opening the dikes in Holland was considered a war crime properly. But in North Korea, a few years later, after the U.S. Air Force had wiped out the whole country, there's nothing left to bomb, they started bombing the dams. That's a huge war crime. It's much worse than bombing the dikes. It was described, but it was described with pride. You know, if you read the official Air Force history or the Air Force Quarterly and so on, they describe it in gruesome detail, but about what a great achievement it was to bomb these dams, to see the huge flood of water scooping out valleys, and to see the rage of the people. So they're Asians who depend on rice. And, you know, here we're really getting them where it hurts. And, I mean, it's just like racist fanaticism, but praised. That's just a couple of years after they hanged German leaders who were doing much less than that. If you don't do what we tell you, you'll just be pulverized. We don't care what you think or what you say. The current U.S. leadership is extreme in this respect, but they are quite frankly and openly committed to the use of violence to control the world, and they say so. So, for example, when Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia was here a couple of weeks ago, he tried to persuade U.S. leaders to moderate their support for Israeli violence. And what Abdullah said is, there's going to be an uprising in the Arab world. It would be really dangerous for your own interests, like oil. And then their reaction was interesting. I mean, he was dismissed, of course, but on interesting grounds. I mean, he was told, you know, it was reported in the New York Times, you can read it. He was told, what they said is, look, Just take a look at what we did to Iraq during Desert Storm. Now we're 10 times that strong. If you want to see how strong, take a look at what we just did in Afghanistan. That's what it's for, to show you what can happen to you if you raise your head. So try to, if you don't do what we tell you, you'll just be pulverized. We don't care what you think or what you say. That's their attitude. And they say so, and it's evident in the actions. And it's not very good for the world, or for the people in the United States. First article I wrote, I know exactly when it was because I remember the event. It was February 1939, after the fall of Barcelona. And it was about the spread of fascism in Europe. I'm 10 years old. I wasn't an activist. But it's a large part of my life ever since then. There was a period of quiescence in the late 50s when the whole country was quiet. But as soon as things began to heat up again in the early 60s, I got back into it with some regret and trepidation, I should say, because I know very well you can't do these things part-time. If you get started, it's going to be all-consuming. And I had lots of things I was very happy doing and didn't want to give them up.
But you chose to.
Somehow.
Or had felt you.
Well, by the time, the beginnings of the Vietnam War were coming along, it was just impossible not to become involved. The Vietnam War actually began for the United States in 1950. And from 1954 to 1960, the U.S. had a kind of a Latin American-style terror regime in place. And it wasn't any joke. They killed about 60 or 70,000 people, but there was no protest. Zero. When Kennedy took over, they escalated it to, pretty soon it became a direct U.S. attack. Still no protest. Through the early 60s, you couldn't get anybody to sign a petition. Nobody would come to a meeting. I remember we used to try to organize meetings on Vietnam. Some of the few people, couple of students, a few others who were interested, but we'd have to put together half a dozen topics. Iran, Venezuela, Vietnam, 6 other topics, and then maybe you could get more people than organizers. By 1965 or 1966, it was becoming a big issue. But protests were met with extreme hostility. Take Boston right here. This is a pretty liberal city. But we couldn't have public protests against the war. They'd be violently broken up. The speakers would be saved from being murdered only by hundreds of state police. And it would be praised, the protests would be, the attack on the protesters would be praised in the liberal media. I remember my wife, I had 2 little girls. My wife and the 2 kids went to a women's protest. It was, you know what it's like. They're not throwing stones, just people walking around with children. And this was in Concord. It's a suburb, quiet, professional, upper-middle-class suburb. They were attacked. People throwing tin cans and tomatoes and so on, and that was considered right. It wasn't until late 1966 that there was enough of a change so you really had substantial public opposition. That's 5 years after the war was started. By then there were hundreds of thousands of American troops rampaging around South Vietnam, and the war, of course, extended to the rest of Indochina, and nobody knows how many people were killed because nobody counted. So another interesting thing about the Vietnam War is we have no idea what the costs were to the Vietnamese. For the United States, we know down to the last person, and the big post-war issue is finding the bones of American pilots, but nobody has any idea how many Vietnamese died. Because you cannot comprehend that we should apply to ourselves the standards you apply to others. That is incomprehensible. If you take a poll among U.S. intellectuals, support for bombing Afghanistan is just overwhelming. How many of them think that you should bomb Washington because of the U.S. war against Nicaragua, let's say, or Cuba, or Turkey, or anyone else? If anyone were to suggest this, they'd be considered insane. You know? But why? I mean, if one is right, why is the other wrong? When you try to get someone to talk about this question, they just will try. They can't comprehend what your question is, because you cannot comprehend that we should apply to ourselves the standards you apply to others. That is incomprehensible. Now, you know, there couldn't be a moral principle more elementary. I mean, all I have to do is read George Bush's favorite philosopher. You know, there's a definition, famous definition in the Gospels of the hypocrite. I mean, the hypocrite is the person who refuses to apply to himself the standards he applies to others. By that standard, just, you know, the entire commentary and discussion of the war, so-called war on terror, is pure hypocrisy, virtually without exception. Can anybody understand that? No, can't understand it. But that's not so unusual. I mean, you know, I'll bet you anything that if you go back to Japan in the 1930s or 40s and you did a poll of intellectuals on the war, you'd probably get the same reactions. I mean, I know it was true in Germany and France and everywhere else. It's just standard. It's ugly, but it's standard. In the last 40 years, the country has just become a lot more civilized in many respects. I mean, the big popular movements that have had a massive effect on the country aren't even from the 60s. They're from the 70s and the 80s. So there was only the bare beginnings of a feminist movement in the 60s. Became a major popular movement in subsequent years. The environmental movement almost didn't exist. It's the 70s and the 80s. The same with the solidarity movements, the anti-nuclear movement, the currently what's called ridiculously anti-globalization, meaning support for a form of globalization that has concern for people, not investors. Those are all much more recent things, and they're massive, and they've changed the character of the country. So I think, look, it's not a pretty world, but I think things have improved. You know, there are many different measures of this, and it's pretty substantial, and I think it's very important. It shows that things can be achieved in the only ways that are around, by educational efforts, by organizing, by activism of all sorts. And we have every opportunity open to us. You know, we're not in Turkey, you know, we're not in Colombia, we're not going to get assassinated, we're not going to get thrown into prisons. Every option is open. And we have all kinds of privilege. It's just a question whether you want to pursue them.
Know your enemy, know yourself. That's the politic. George Bush is way worse than Bin Laden is. Know your enemy, know yourself. That's the politic. FBI, CIA, the real terrorists. Know your enemy, know yourself. That's the politic. George Bush is way worse than Bin Laden is. Know your enemy, know yourself.